Today we have with us Dr. Travis Knoll, who received his Ph.D. in history from Duke University in 2022. He currently teaches history at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. His research examines links between racial justice policy and religious civil society organizations in the formation of international progressive organizations. In particular, his research focuses on Brazil. His dissertation, which was funded in part by a Social Science Research Council SSRC grant, explored the role of the Progressive Catholic Church in Brazil's Black movement from the 1970s to the present, with a focus on the drive for race-based affirmative action in university admissions, an effort that bore fruit in the early 2010s with a Supreme Court decision confirming the constitutionality of race-based quotas for Afro-Brazilian students in universities admissions. Dr. Knoll has also been involved with a two-country, two-university project that between Duke University and the Universidade Federal Rural do Rio de Janeiro. And that project examined the impact of race-based quotas on social mobility for Afro-Brazilian students, particularly with a focus on quota students' experiences of university life and some of the barriers that remained to their being integrated into the university system in the face of socioeconomic disadvantage. Dr. Knoll is going to show us today, he's going to screen his documentary, The Book Revolution, which looks at the role of progressive Catholic Church in the Black movement in Brazil with a focus on the drive for race-based affirmative action. So I'm going to introduce Dr. Knoll, ask Dr. Knoll to come up here, and he will introduce the film briefly. We will watch the film, and then we'll discuss it.
Excellent. So this film came out of an idea to better synthesize this large project that I was working on. I won the SSRC grant, which allows you to build your own budget, in 2018. This was a election year. I went to Brazil just a month before the election that brought Jair Bolsonaro to power. And the idea was to, again, talk to militants themselves to kind of create a collage of voices, if you will, to elaborate on the relationship between the Catholic Church, popular education groups that focused on preparing students for Brazil's competitive college entrance exams, and movements to spark appreciation not only of Black culture, but also emphasize the importance of Black citizenship and political participation. So I was lucky enough to meet through one of my friends in Brazil, the anchor and Black journalist Luciana Barreto, who herself had gone through one of these college prep courses that is discussed in the documentary. And the community rapper Dudu do Morro Agudo had also edited the documentary related to the project that Brian just described. So that's a little bit of the background of how the authors of this documentary came to know each other. Making it in 2019 was a bittersweet effort. So all of these militants had agreed to share their stories, but often there was a great tension between the recounting the victory that they had achieved, but also confronting the current political climate as well. And so you'll see that tension in the documentary itself. And they also discuss the complex relationship with the church, because even though the church provided space and resources to some degree to launch these popular education initiatives, the church was not always understanding of the more radical demands of these militants. So how do you acknowledge the role of a traditional institution like the Catholic Church, at the same time emphasize that it continues to have serious shortcomings when on the issue of race? What's his documentary's relevance today? Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva has campaigned on his successful education expansion, which doubled the number of public universities and tripled the number of private universities between 2002 and 2012. The time this documentary was filmed, he was in jail on trumped up corruption charges. And he also, before going to jail, he held a rally at a union hall that had launched his profile on the national stage. And there he said, I'm going to jail, not because of these false accusations, but I'm going to jail because I facilitated the entrance of poor Black students into the university, of domestic workers into the daughters and sons into the university, right? And he has continued to center affirmative action in his campaign rhetoric, and also prioritize education. In a recent debate with President Jair Bolsonaro, he said he would make Brazil a country of science again by reinvigorating its university. And so this documentary really talks about one aspect of an attempt to acknowledge the symbolic power that higher education still plays in Brazil's national consciousness. So without further ado, we can start the film. Take questions. Thank you.
Criminais já sofreram violência policial. A cada 4 pessoas, 60% dos jovens de periferia sem antecedentes criminais já sofreram violência.
Dude, I will. I can share mine if I have to. Give us just a second, folks.
Apologies. Can you hear?
Yeah, I can hear you. I can't hear the. We were hearing the film at the start, but we're not hearing it now. I was just wanting us to get it full screen. We were hearing it at the beginning, though. So if you can just click the full screen button, we should be able to hear it okay.
Okay, sounds good.
Just go ahead and send it full screen first.
Okay.
Right, the box in the lower right corner.
Okay. Can you see it right there?
No, it's not full screen.
It's froze.
Well, I guess we'll play it like this. We have to.
What about now? Can you see it?
Yeah, it's not going full screen at all. Oh, now it's full screen. Perfect.
Sorry.
Okay.
60% dos jovens de periferia sem antecedentes criminais já sofreram violência policial. A cada 4 pessoas mortas pela polícia, 3 são negras. Nas universidades brasileiras, apenas 2% dos alunos são negros. A cada 4 horas, um jovem negro morre violentamente em São Paulo. Aqui quem fala é Primo Preto, mais um sobrevivente.
Nós trabalhávamos muito com os alunos com aquele rap do Racionais MCs, que começava dizendo que 2% dos universitários apenas eram negros.
Que a universidade fosse um espaço para brancos, quer fossem brancos de direita, quer fossem brancos de esquerda, eram todos brancos. Nisso eles eram todos muito tranquilos com esse lugar. A questão do negro estar fora da universidade não era um problema para eles, era um problema para nós. Isso era um problema terrível para nós.
Então houve um movimento na América Latina E aí o documento de Puebla que veio está falando sobre essa relação dos povos tradicionais e a demanda da igreja de responder a isso. Porque esses povos estavam dentro da igreja e eles precisavam de uma resposta, né, da igreja para esse sofrimento, para essa opressão que se encontrava na América Latina.
O movimento pré-vestibular surge a partir de uma ação da Igreja Católica cunhada pelo grupo de religiosos negros e indígenas, e o Davi foi representante, mas foi toda a ideia do pré-vestibular, ela foi cunhada dentro desse grupo.
Tínhamos fortemente uma conjunção de padres negros, seminaristas negros e leigos negros que lutavam muito por esse espaço. E houveram momentos de muita tensão, quando os padres negros, os religiosos negros, eram podados por seus superiores. Então foi quando os leigos decidiram eles mesmos avançar independente dos padres e dos religiosos.
Quando eu, né, comecei, a estética era totalmente diferente, né? Nossa, do grupo dos agentes pastoral negro, né? Era diferente. Éramos a maioria mulheres, negras, domésticas, ensino fundamental e médio, a maioria usava os nossos cabelos, né? Sempre foram de Enês, antigamente era pente quente, né? Então, nossas roupas eram diferentes e tal. Porque o que tinha nessa Baixada Fluminense que pudesse aguçar o nosso desejo de mudanças? O nosso desejo de sonhar. Sonhar o quê, né? Para você sonhar, você tem que conhecer aquilo que você pode projetar para o seu futuro. E a Baixada não nos oferecia esse conhecimento de projetar.
Bom, havia no início da década de 90 um debate digamos, mais geral, que era um debate que estava no âmbito do debate político sobre neoliberalismo, que era digamos, um aumento da demanda da classe média e também dos mais pobres pelo ensino superior.
O pré-vestibular surge em 93, né? Na realidade, o pré-vestibular faz parte de uma ação da Igreja Católica aqui na Baixada, né?
Quando se deu lá em agosto de 93 foi um ano muito triste, que foi o ano da chacina da Candelária e da chacina de Vigário Geral. Um intervalo mais ou menos de um mês, de uma para outra.
O primeiro start foi nos anos 80, quando eu era padre da Catedral Duque de Caxias e fui assessorar um encontro de fim de semana para a juventude. Eram 100 jovens em um sítio dos franciscanos ali na Baixada Fluminense. Perguntei em um certo momento ao centro da palestra quantos queriam fazer faculdade e só 2 pensavam em fazer faculdade. Então esse fato me fez levar um susto e dizer, não, aqui tem uma causa. Essa causa me exige posicionamento.
Então, a partir de 1989, a gente estava aqui no agente pastoral negro, chamado APN, da Igreja Católica. Eu era católico, né? E pela vivência na teologia da libertação, eu fui descobrindo essa consciência racial. E essa consciência racial, dentro da APN, a gente entendeu que era importante ter o nível superior.
E no dia 5 de junho de 1993, nós fizemos a aula inaugural com cerca de 100 alunos na igreja de São João de Meriti. Aliás, não foi bem assim. Cerca de 100 alunos, exatamente. Cerca de 100 alunos e 2 turmas.
Hoje, mais de 3.000 jovens negros e brancos pobres entraram na PUC-Rio a partir do nosso trabalho. Trabalho da Educafro, trabalho do pré-vestibular para negros e carentes, trabalho do pré-vestibular da Maré. e dezenas de pré-vestibulares que nasceram em todo o Rio de Janeiro, inspirado no trabalho inicial nosso, que nasceu desse encontro com os jovens da Pastoral da Juventude que não queriam fazer faculdade.
Então um primo meu falou para mim, olha, você quer fazer faculdade, mas não tem grana para pagar pré-vestibular? Lá na igreja tem um pré-vestibular comunitário lá. E aí me deram um questionário, me fazendo perguntas que eu nunca tinha, respondido. Perguntando a minha cor, como que eu me considerava, se eu já tinha sofrido racismo, enfim, coisas desse jeito. Eu fiquei assustado e resolvi saber o que era, né?
Se a gente for pensar, não está diretamente, o acesso limitado à universidade, ela não está diretamente ligada à pobreza, ela está ligada ao racismo, né? Porque são nas áreas periféricas, nas favelas, né, das diferentes cidades, onde você tem de forma mais massiva a presença da população negra. Então é essa população que tem um acesso mais limitado à educação, porque em algum momento da vida tem que optar pelo trabalho e não pela formação.
Pré-vestibular, o nome era pré-vestibular para negros, só. Então Alexandre e outros fizeram uma revolução contra o nome e queriam tirar o nome negro e queria botar outro nome, desfavorecido, empobrecido, queriam outro nome assim. E para nós o forte era ser o nome negro. Queríamos mesmo marcar terreno, pré-vestibular para negros.
O Frei Davi, que é mais experiente nesse processo, trazia de forma mais convicta a importância de fazer um trabalho para negros. Eu, Antônio e Luciano, que víamos da educação popular, né, leitores de Paulo Freire, estudantes dessa linha de pensamento, da conscientização, etc., achavam que isso tinha que ser mais aberto.
O Alexandre hoje, o Alexandre Nascimento, é um dos maiores negros conscientes do Brasil, mas naquele tempo ele não tinha consciência racial e ele foi um dos que bateu de frente contra o nome negro.
Nós fazíamos uma seleção e os mais carentes nós privilegiávamos. Um dos quesitos era a questão raça. Nós privilegiávamos o aluno na hora do empate, se fosse branco ou negro, entrava o negro, porque entendíamos que a questão racial ela era definidora da condição que a pessoa se encontrava.
Hoje, né, que nós estamos vendo esse resultado. A maioria das mulheres estão formadas, né? Umas estão doutoras, trabalhando nas universidades Tocantins, outra está em Costa Rica, que é a irmã Silvia, a Regina, tem a Sônia Martins de Queimado, formada, tem a Anaíse em Minas, tem várias pessoas, né? Tem Vera Triunfo, que é do Rio Grande do Sul, que é uma grande escritora, pessoa que fala sobre a Lei 10.639, que está e era dos agentes pastoral negro nessa época e que foram nossas formadoras. Mas hoje são doutoras e hoje são referências.
Quando eu percebo a pobreza e percebo os avanços que a educação me proporcionou, eu penso um pouco nessa dimensão, né? Penso um pouco a partir da minha trajetória e da trajetória dessas amigas, e naquele contexto, era um contexto de que a juventude estava preparada só para casar e ter filhos, e isso sempre me incomodou muito, né? Então eu sempre pensei que a gente podia muito mais, né? Que o contexto, né, e os acessos que a Baixada nos dava eram acessos limitados que não nos permitia alcançar e ver o mundo de forma muito mais ampla. Então eu acho que eu pego a juventude nesse momento, né, é um momento de efervescência dos movimentos populares.
Eu vejo as mulheres negras as maiores lutadoras, né, de combate ao extermínio da juventude negra e dos homens negros. Por que eu falo isso? Porque são elas que estão na rua pedindo, né, por justiça, são elas que estão na porta da delegacia dizendo que aquele jovem que foi assassinado não era o traficante, que era estudante, era trabalhador. E são elas que lutam por direitos. Porque quando você olha para o movimento, não só da favela, como da periferia, Baixada, esses lugares mais à margem da sociedade, quem está nessas lutas continuam sendo as mulheres.
Então eu falo como parte, né, de uma juventude que precisa ser observada, e eu estou falando da juventude negra, porque para mim pobreza, né, você tem pobreza num sentido muito amplo, mas para mim a pobreza ela tem cor, né? Então é uma juventude negra, são os jovens que são exterminados, são as meninas que são abusadas fisicamente, psicologicamente, que sofrem bullying. Ah, tá, então a gente trabalha com bullying. Quando você vai perceber, né, as denúncias que chegam no bullying, é um bullying voltado para a questão racial.
A Igreja Católica ela deu todo o apoio, porque nós tínhamos aqui na Diocese de Nova Iguaçu, um bispo muito comprometido com a sociedade, com o movimento social, que era um bispo Dom Adriano Hipólito, ele era vivo nessa época. E nós tínhamos os agentes de pastoral negros, né? Eu saí rápido do APN, do agente pastoral negro, fui para a Comissão Diocesana de Pastoral Operária. Então a gente ficou pensando coisas sindicais, de organização da cidade como um todo. Esse bispo, ele era muito envolvido com as lutas sociais.
Nós sabemos da trajetória do Dom Adriano, né? E como ele sofreu aqui na Baixada, por ele ter um lado realmente específico, dizer, eu estou desse lado, que é o lado do povo. Porque quando um bispo fala que está realmente do lado do povo e vai para os assentamentos, como o Dom Adriano foi, ele foi para os lados onde estava a periferia, onde tinha pessoas passando fome. Então é aquilo, né? Que ele foi realmente preso, ele foi sequestrado, sofreu muito.
A igreja, a relação era muito mais de cessão de espaço. Da ajuda logística, eu acho que a igreja poderia ter ajudado mais.
Isso foi tranquilo? Não foi tranquilo. Foi tenso. E muitas vezes, portanto, esse movimento gerou conflitos gravíssimos com os bispos, a ponto dos bispos proibirem dos agentes de pastoral negros serem ligados à Igreja Católica.
Mas o Frei Davi tinha apoio do bispo de Nova Iguaçu, Dom Adriano, e tinha o apoio do bispo de Caxias, que agora não me recordo o nome. Paulo Morelli. Mauro Morelli.
Mas a religião, a Igreja Católica e todas, né, sobretudo a Igreja Católica, que é de onde eu falo, né, que é o meu lugar de fala e de experiência, ela também atravessa por essa questão do racismo. A igreja ainda naquela ocasião, ela reproduzia o racismo na mesma proporção. Então, ter um pré-vestibular, né, voltado para estudantes negros também incomodava uma parcela da igreja.
Nem no tempo mais límpido, mais firme, mais hegemônico da teologia da libertação, a causa do negro foi tranquila. Sempre nossos posicionamentos e nossa ocupação de espaço foi muito estratégica. Porque nós sabíamos que o poder era contra, não é porque não entendia o Evangelho. O poder era contra porque o poder católico sabia do potencial revolucionário do saber do negro. Se o negro dominasse o saber, esse negro iria provocar uma revolução da situação. Não uma revolução de arma, mas uma revolução do livro, uma revolução de disputa de espaço. Então, hoje, essa disputa de espaço entre negro e branco, que está explícito no Brasil, onde os brancos vão lá fraudar as cotas de negro para o negro não crescer nos espaços de saber acadêmico, essa disputa poderia ter acontecido nos anos 80, se a igreja não fosse tão medrosa.
Então, o Davi, de alguma forma, ele traz para o seu sacerdócio a missão de colocar a igreja a serviço da causa antirracista. Então, ele fez quase tudo que ele faz, pelo menos desde quando eu conheço, quase tudo que ele faz dentro da igreja tem um viés de luta contra o racismo.
Um grupo de nós, negros católicos, decidimos, vamos parar de querer estar dentro da estrutura da igreja. Vamos fazer algo independente. E aí foi quando nasceu o pré-vestibular para negros e carentes. Nasceu por um grupo de nós católicos E esse grupo, então, decidimos fazer algo independente para a igreja não ter medo de nós.
Dentro da universidade era o melhor, né? Era o melhor, né? A gente fazia parte da universidade, mas não nos viam nesse contexto. Nunca nos viam como estudante da universidade.
Então, no segundo ano, a PUC do Rio se interessou, ampliou o processo, alguns cursos ampliaram bastante, como o curso de serviço social. O curso de serviço social foi o curso que mais ofereceu bolsas.
A gente não tinha problema, se a gente não tinha dinheiro para comprar um lanche, se a gente mal tinha dinheiro para pagar passagem de ônibus, o transporte, a gente queria estar na universidade. A gente achava que a universidade tinha alguma coisa para nos oferecer.
Aqui no Rio, decidi fazer diferente. Em vez de procurar o reitor, procuramos a pessoa que tinha o poder de definir bolsas, que era o professor Augusto Sampaio.
O professor Augusto conseguiu convencer os setores dirigentes da PUC da pertinência dessa política. Então, é como se a gente tivesse saído ali de uma experiência de 5, no outro ano já estava mais de 50 pessoas entraram na PUC.
Então, tá muito evidenciado que um dos focos novos não é mais a inclusão, mas é a permanência. É mais ou menos de cada 100 jovens que a Educaf colocou para dentro das universidades públicas, de cada 100 jovens, 30 já voltaram, porque não teve bolsa moradia e alimentação. Ou seja, falta um plano de inclusão. De cada 100 jovens que a Educaf botou para dentro das universidades públicas, mais ou menos 2 se suicidaram. De cada 100 jovens, mais ou menos 2 se suicidaram. Por quê? Porque houve um tremendo choque entre a realidade de sua vida com a realidade da universidade.
Nós fomos para lá para receber todo aquele conhecimento crítico que era importantíssimo para a nossa formação. E ao longo dessa caminhada a gente percebeu que a universidade também precisava da gente. A universidade precisa ter professores negros, a universidade precisa ter professoras negras, a universidade precisa ter matérias ligadas a direitos humanos e relações étnico-raciais. Ninguém pensava nisso. Nós já dávamos aulas de direitos humanos e relações raciais no pré-vestibular, na década de 90.
Um dos lemas que nós usávamos era que um dia nós queremos deixar de existir. Era assim, o nosso maior sonho é deixar de existir um dia. Ou seja, mas para a gente deixar de existir, tinham que vir ali políticas públicas que acabaram vindo algumas delas. Por exemplo, a nossa experiência com a PUC do Rio, não quero deixar de falar isso porque isso é emblemático. A nossa experiência com a PUC do Rio é o embrião do ProUni.
E nesse momento de hoje, já é mais difícil. Nós estamos com mais dificuldade. Nossa voz é muito baixa, né? Nós não temos canais de interlocuções mais amplas, maiores, para estar falando com o nosso povo. Nós fazemos realmente trabalho de formiguinha.
Então, por exemplo, nós temos lá um grande número de alunos evangélicos que estudam dentro do terreiro. Então, isso para a gente é um ganho, porque esses alunos, ao final do processo, eles estão totalmente modificados no pensamento que eles têm preconceituoso em relação ao povo de terreiro.
Então, assim, eu acho que a opção pelos pobres, na realidade, ela é uma opção pelos pobres e pelos negros, porque vários estudiosos já dizem isso, que o racismo ele é o núcleo da desigualdade no mundo.
Então, o sacerdócio, eu tenho plena convicção que o sacerdócio é cada vez mais perfeito quanto mais ele serve a causas. Então, para mim, o sacerdócio da Igreja Católica e o sacerdócio que eu faço no movimento social não tem diferenciação. Ele é sacerdócio único, pleno e tem a mesma fonte. Jesus Cristo, mesma fonte. São Francisco, mesma fonte. Luther King, mesma fonte. Mahatma Gandhi, mesma fonte. Nelson Mandela.
Todo mundo ganha com o resultado. O país ganha com o resultado, sobretudo o país. O país ganha muito quando uma mulher negra, filha de uma empregada doméstica, se torna médica, pediatra. Pô, isso é revolucionário.
Todo o meu trabalho
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much. Is this okay going? Okay. I don't know. Okay, good. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. We're going to take questions from both the Zoom audience and from the in-person audience. If you're in person, have a question, just speak it loudly, because I think the speakers up here in the front of the room, and that's how the Zoom people will be able to hear. And if you're watching via Zoom, you can submit your question using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen anytime you like. Anybody have a question? Anybody want to get started? I mean, I can get us started. So the question I have for you is, so this important role that activists in the church had, throughout a lot of this, throughout the process to, establish racial quotas. What role has the church continued to have now in the present, and exactly the same activists had in the present as Bolsonaro? If he hasn't attacked the quotas directly, or at least, tried to repeal them via legislation that I'm aware of, but it's certainly a hostile environment politically right now in Brazil for people with any group that represents people who are marginalized, not just Afro-Brazilians, but also LGBTQ people, indigenous people, pretty much everyone. And so what kind of mobilization has there been to try to preserve some of these elements of racial justice that have been institutionalized in Brazil amidst the depredations of the Bolsonaro government?
Yeah, so I'll start with a more general question first, because as you rightly observed, Bolsonaro has not actually introduced legislation or encouraged necessarily legislation repealing quotas. In 2018, he gave an interview, as all presidential candidates do, to basically Brazil's Meet the Press, Roda Viva, right? And he was asked, a wide range of questions on race-based issues, and he was a bomb thrower. He said, I didn't enslave anyone. I'm not better. Blacks aren't better than me. And for the Portuguese never stepped foot in Africa to enslave, which is completely ridiculous, right? And he's saying this kind of thing. And so the reporters are getting very anxious at this moment. And they said, okay, so what are you going to do with quotas? You're just going to undo them, okay? And he said, no, not undo, but maybe just reduce the percentage, maybe. And he goes, but that's not, I can't really do that. That's really for Parliament to decide, right? And so he's really, in 2018, at the height of his power, when he brings a party that was created a few months before his election, right, from 0 to 50 seats in the Chamber of Deputies. Even then, he is not willing to, even though his son was the first to file suit at the state level against affirmative action, to end the policies. Now the question is here, why? And it's because affirmative action in Brazil has 60% approval rating, and that was even before it was passed. And the reason for its durability is that it includes, within slots reserved for public school students, right, quotas based on income, quotas based on race, both Afro-Brazilian and indigenous, quotas based on disability. Some state level versions of affirmative action even included quotas for children of deceased police officers. Right. So what Lula did, he managed to create a grand coalition where the excluded felt of various classes felt like they had a stake in the policy. Right. So even though symbolically and numerically the race-based quotas are the most important, the policy also has buy-in from multiple segments of society. And so that's the more general question. What are people doing to defend the policy? It's not under attack. What they did at the beginning was to design it in such a way where there was input from, or there was vested interest in various segments of society. Now, the Catholic Church itself, since Bolsonaro got elected, has been under attack. During the campaign in 2018, he called the bishops' conference, basically the group of the official group of bishops that gather every year to issue policy suggestions from the church. He called them the rotten part of the church because they had a history of standing up to the 21-year military dictatorship between 1964 and 1985, and a dictatorship that Bolsonaro had repeatedly supported, right? Repeatedly said that maybe we should go back to in some ways, right? And so the Catholic Church has been under attack. Previously, with the democratic transition at post-1985, the church had taken the position, we're not going to get involved in party politics. We will speak to broader issues. We will defend human rights, but we're not going to get involved in partisan politics. And they've largely stuck to that. They've released statements in support of the communities, the lands of that were descended from fugitive slave communities. They have defended indigenous rights. They're constantly talking about deforestation, not only in the Brazilian Amazon, but in what's called the Pan-Amazon region, which is the 8 countries that make up the Amazon rainforest. So the church continues, as a matter of course, to defend these policies. In terms of introducing quotas, per se, the Bishop Conference eventually got behind it, but they weren't as public with race-based quotas as they were with indigenous rights, right? And this goes back to the racism issue, right? It's much more easy in Brazil to defend indigenous populations than it is Afro-descendant populations, and that's just an issue there. But yes, the church has released protests and all sorts of things.
Any questions from the room?
I have one question. What is being done, or what has been done over the years to do with retention rather than inclusion? Retention of Afro-Brazilian students.
So in terms of retention, and not just enrollment, but retention, many of the same challenges that face first generation and minoritized students here in the United States, right? Food, housing, geographic distance. In my classes in Charlotte, sometimes I have commuter students that come all the way from Raleigh 2 hours away, right? So how do we make policies that make it easier for them to go to school wherever they choose or can get admitted, right? And so those are some of the practical issues for retention. Financial aid, reduced food prices, this kind of thing. At a cultural level, it's a lot about making space for the type of personal experiences that minoritized and socioeconomically disadvantaged students have experienced. So in California, a good positive example of this is the rise of ethnic studies. Really got going here in California. And in Brazil, there is something similar. There are now research institutes dedicated specifically to the study of Black and indigenous politics and also history. They're called NIABIs, research centers for the study of Black and indigenous issues. There's now proposed quotas for graduate education now. And so yeah, it's an ongoing effort. And this goes to my second point. Bolsonaro doesn't have to attack the quota issue, attack quotas directly to make them ineffective. It's part of his definancing of public education, higher education in Brazil. And so it's great if you have quotas on the books, but if no one can afford to go and there aren't any scholarships available, who's going to take the quota even if they get in? It's like here in the United States. You know, if you get into a school and it's $50,000 a year, you're not going to go there. You're going to go somewhere else that you can afford, right? And so it's a constant challenge. Right? So there's been both ways that it can be addressed practically and culturally, but also ways that the opponent can attack it. Culturally, less so. Culturally and practically. Right?
Can I say? I think that's very interesting that you got what church has been doing for this, but also like in my hand, I was like always reminding that church was also like kind of responsible somehow for putting racism in Brazil. It's like it has an important role in that thing, and I can see now like Bolsonaro has a lot of support, major for evangelicals, but also from other religions, all of them, even church, Catholic church, like we've been saying here. Do you think that now you can see some kind of division in Catholic church, like people who are more supporting him and probably more racist than the other one? Do you think that could be an issue?
I saw in 2018 much more division, because in 2018 the Catholic vote was split 50-50. And I was in the Baixada Fluminense, which continues to be a base of support of votes for Bolsonaro. And I'll get to the Baixada specifically in a minute. But yes, there was stark divisions in 2018. Now, Bolsonaro has made a series of missteps. His followers interrupted a service at the big national shrine in Aparecida. He is related to this false priest with the big cross on. The Orthodox, Greek Orthodox have said, he's not part of us. The Catholics have said, he's not really part of us. He's like this made up priest, right? And so there's sort of he kind of came power with this kind of, the old saying is tradition, property, and family. But then even some moderate bishops have been saying, he's kind of been instrumentalizing religion. And right in the middle of church services, right? He tried to hijack a procession, a traditional Catholic procession for a political rally, he and his followers. And so I think this time the Catholic vote is stronger for Lula, in part because of these missteps, but in part because the Catholic Church takes the position in Brazil, and has since at least the 1970s, that we are not beholden to one political ideology or party, right? And so we're not going to tell our voters how to vote. We're going to tell them what issues should be important to consider when you're voting. We're going to say, we're going to define what it means to work in the common good. But we're not going to indicate votes. At least that's at the official bishop's level, right? You have some right-wing Catholic priests and some left-wing Catholic priests. Lula met with Frei David, who was here in this video, 2 days after the runoff. He did it at the Lula Institute because he didn't want to mix too much religion with politics. He could have gone to the Franciscan convent, but he chose not to, right? But they talked about affirmative action, and it was a counter to a bunch of fake news that said that Lula was atheist and had made a pact with the devil, right? And so Lula has also been more aggressive than Fernando Haddad, who was a minister of education, by the way, who expanded all of these universities and implemented quotas. But when Fernando Haddad ran in 2018, he didn't really have a notion about the importance that these fake news or these memes played in the election. So Lula has been very aggressive in putting out his own memes. Like, yes, Bolsonaro has been to a Mason temple, right? Yes, he had that talk about, going into 15 and 20-year-old Venezuelan girls' houses, right? And so I think Lula, just from an electoral strategy point of view, Lula has been a little more aggressive in combating this moral discourse of Bolsonaro's by saying, I've always been Catholic, and I didn't get baptized in the River Jordan twice, because my unions worked with Catholic bishops when I struck, in the 1970s and in 1980, right? So I think the Catholic vote is part of that. People know Lula's story. Right? They aren't pressured by the hierarchy to vote a certain way. And evangelical votes work differently. And that's not to judge evangelicals in Brazil, but it's just to say that a lot of times the churches and the relationship to political mobilization work very differently among evangelicals. But yes, affirmative action, the creation of the Black pastoral agents, and the acceptance of them at the institutional level was part of the church's conscious decision in the 1980s, especially in 1988 on the centenary of the abolition of slavery, to say, we fucked up, right? And, as a traditional institution, there are certain values and religious traditions we're not letting go of, but within those traditions, how do we put racial justice at the center of our theology? And it was very, very controversial campaign. Lenten social campaign, they call it a fraternity campaign, when they chose the position of Black Brazilians in society as the theme that year in 1988. It was a big controversy. So the institution was not and is not completely unified, but there have been steps, and quotas are an offshoot of that, to support racial justice initiatives, precisely because the church was fundamental as a colonial institution.
I've got another question for you. Yeah. This might be getting into the Brazilianist weeds a little bit, but I'm not saying you're doing this, but very often you see among scholars and journalists who are based in Rio de Janeiro this tendency to conflate what's going on with Rio with what's going on in all of Brazil. But of course, Brazil is not Rio, and Rio is not Brazil. So I'm sure this was addressed in your dissertation, and probably, or if it wasn't, it was certainly brought up at your defense. But to what extent can we take what happened in Nova Iguaçu, Baixada Fluminense, and Rio de Janeiro? And because, of course, the first place where racial quotas were instituted was not in Rio. It was at the Universidade de Brasília.
It was in Rio.
Was it UFRJ? Okay.
It was UERJ, State University.
Oh, first State University. Okay. First federal was Winnipeg.
Yeah, Rio was 2001. The law was passed in 2000 and took effect in 2001. There was a proposal for public school quotas in 2000. And then race-based quotas came in 2001. That's where Flavio Bolsonaro, one of Bolsonaro's sons, does his lawsuit in 2003.
Okay.
So in fact, yes, Rio is the center for the implementation of a broad-based affirmative action policy that's going to be an inspiration for the federal challenge. But they come through two different mechanisms. So in the Brazilian Constitution, you're right, federal story is very different from the Rio story. The Rio story was this governor, evangelical governor with a left-wing history, comes to power, Antônio Garotinho, and he gets conservative elements together with progressive elements that we see here in the documentary, and they all agree quotas are a good thing, so let's create quotas for a bunch of people, right? Public school quotas, which means reserve seats for anyone who goes to public school, as well as specifically race-based quotas, right? That's passed through the state legislature by voice vote, because it's Garotinho's initiative and he has a lot of power, and so no one messes with it. Federal University is different. The way they made their policy is the executive council of the university. You know this better than I, because you look through the case documents long before I ever got to graduate school, Brian. But the university council made the policy, and they could do that because the Brazilian Constitution makes the public federal universities institutions that are able to make their own policy, right? Here in the United States, for example, part of affirmative action, the affirmative action debate is these universities have come up with their own admissions policies, but they aren't the federal government. We don't owe any deference to universities, public or otherwise, to make affirmative actions. The question is it constant? Do we think the Supreme Court it's consonant with the Constitution? Whereas if Congress passes an affirmative action plan, and they did in the United States for certain employment opportunity initiatives, then the court has to give greater deference because, oh, it's Congress making the law. So, not total. We have a kind of crazy Supreme Court here in the United States right now. But in Brazil, at the federal level, the universities are making their own policy, right? At the state level, a few years even before 2004, the state legislatures are passing their own versions of affirmative action. In first Rio, then Bahia in 2002.
So was the struggle already going on in Bahia before, like parallel to the struggle in Rio before 2002, or did it really get underway in Bahia after things were instituted in Rio in 2001?
Yeah, David cites as his sort of inspiration for creating these courses, the Steve Biko Institute in Bahia, which had started about a year or so before, right? But if you trace through the newspapers, there were even like vocational courses. There was a 1983 newspaper clipping that the bishop, mentioned in his documentary, cut out. These clippings are available at the archive. That was vocational, the 1983 now, vocational education for Black and poor people, negros y carentes. And so you can see this idea of a grassroots educational program precedes even the Institute of Steve Biko. But the Rio activists are part of a network. And Josie gets at that when she goes, we have these Black pastoral agents from Minas. One nun went to Costa Rica after she got married. Another was from Rio Grande do Sul, right? And so we have these networks all over the country, and they're all working for the same goal. And I think Educafro has several. Their headquarters is in Sao Paulo now. Right? They met in this church at first, in this church in a poorer city in the Baixada, and then he wanted to go do an NGO structure, so he broke off Frei David from this PVNC group and went and founded Educafro in Sao Paulo, but they still worked very closely together. So yeah, it's a national story.